Good morning, guys. Am I audible to all of you?
Yes, sir. Good morning, sir.
Okay. Today class is very important because today we are also going to discuss one of the important concept, right? Called the transactions. So you already know what is transaction from SQL Server point of view, right? So if I say transaction means if you want to execute some DML statement as a single unit, right? Then you can execute those statement as part of a transaction. Then what will transaction ensure? Transaction will ensure that all the DML statements are executed successfully or none of them are executed, right? So if any of the DML statement failed, then all the DML statements are going to be failed and whatever changes made to the database, right, those are going to be rolled back. And if all the DML statements are executed successfully, then changes are made permanently to the database. This is nothing but what we can say transaction, right? Let us try to understand this thing with one example, right? So see, what is the most important thing in today's world, right? The most important thing in today's world is data, right? In anything you can take into consideration whenever we are developing one application means data is there. If data is not there, then what is the use of that application, right? You can take any application. You can take a Facebook, right? You can take a WhatsApp, right? Facebook means data is there. What kind of data? Your profile information, whatever post you have posted on the Facebook, right? Whatever photo, video you have uploaded on the Facebook, this is nothing but data. WhatsApp, you can take into consideration what is data. Data means whatever information we are sending, that is nothing but our data. You can take the example of Gmail, right? In Gmail, what is data? The data in the sense of whatever mail, right? Whatever information or whatever document you are sharing or you are receiving, this is nothing but data. You can take the example of any banking application. Whatever data means your profile information, your bank balance, right? Whatever transaction you are doing, how many amounts you are transferring from your account to other accounts, how many amounts you are receiving from other accounts, right? These are nothing but data. So in today's world, the most important thing is data. Whatever application you develop, data should be there. If no data means no application. And the most challenging job, right, is to keep the data secure, is to keep the data consistent, right? So data is there, but we need to provide security to the data. We need to make sure the data is going to be in a consistent state, right? The database systems, right, like SQL Server or like Oracle, MySQL, right, they are going to store the data. And ADO.NET is one of the data access technologies provided by Microsoft to access the data which is stored in the database. This is what we have already learned. Let us first understand what do we mean by data consistency, and then we'll understand what is transaction. Right? Say you are having two accounts, right? You are having one account table. Within that account table, as you can see, let's assume there are two account information. One account number is account one, name is James, balance is 1000. Account number two, name is Smith, and his balance is also 1000, right? Now our business requirement is we need to transfer 500 from account one to account two, right? Suppose you want to transfer 500 from this account to this account, then what are the things you need to do? Why I'm saying at least, it might be possible there are multiple or more update statements are there, but at least two update statement is required. One of the update statement is going to reduce the amount what you are transferring from account one. That update statement is going to reduce the account balance, and whatever amount you are transferring to the account 2, that update statement is going to do that operation on account 2. That means from account 1 we need to update the balance by 500, and in account 2 we need to add that 500, right? This is the two update operations, right, we need to perform. Right? Now let us understand these things clearly, right? Our intention is data consistency, right? We want to achieve data consistency, right? Once the consistency means what? Now, once the update statements are executed, the data should be in a consistent state. Consistent state means anyhow, if I'm going to add this to balance, then the balance should be 2000, right? Currently, the balance is 2000. Account 1 balance 2000. Account 2 balance is also 2000, right? And once I transfer the amount from this account to this account, right? Then also, if I'm going to add this to account balance, then it should be 2000, right? In that case, it should be 500 in account 1, 1500 in account 1. See, if I'm getting 2000, that means the data is in a consistent state. Let us understand the different use cases or different scenarios when I'm updating this two statement. Let's assume that the case one is, let's assume that the first update statement was executed successfully, but the second update statement failed. If the first update statement executed successfully, that means what will become account one balance, right?
500.
See, currently account one name is James, his balance is 1000, right? Account two, his name is James, his balance is also 2000. So data consistency means what? Total amount should be 2000. If total is not 2000, means data is not consistent. Case one, right? So, and here we are having two update statements. Let me take this update statement to the data or to the UI. I mean the notepad, right? Let me do these things. Right. So case one, the case one scenario is that first update is success. Update one successful. Update one successful means what? What will become the account one balance? Can anybody tell me?
500.
1000 minus 500. That means update one balance will become 500. Second update failed.
500, not 5,000.
500, no? Right? Okay. Update 2. Update 2 failed. If update 2 failed, then what will be the update account to balance? Can anybody tell me?
1,000.
How? Case 2. Case 2. First update statement failed. In case 2, we have another scenario where first update statement failed. So update balance is going to be the same 1000, right? And update 2 is going to be successful. Right? Update 2 successful means account to balance is going to be 500. Case 3, both the update statement are failed. If both the update statement are failed, then what will be the account balance? Both are going to be same.
Status quo maintained.
This is my case 3. And case 4 means both are successful. Update 1 successful, update 2 also going to be successful, right? So now let us understand the four use cases for these two update statements. So in this case, when the first update statement successfully, it is successfully reduced the account balance, but second update statement failed, so it is unable to add that amount. So in this case, what will be the total amount? Data consistency, what is going to be the total amount? It is going to be 1500, because in account 1 balance is 500 and the account balance 2 is going to be 1000. Is there any data consistency?
No.
No. Data consistency is not there, right? Now, if I'm taking this thing, right, again in the second use cases, is there any data consistency?
No.
No. Now, coming to the third, is there any data consistency?
Yes.
Yes, because the total amount is going to be 2000, right? So there is data consistency. And coming to the 4 use cases, is there any data consistency? Yes or no?
Yes.
Right. So basically what happened, now if one of the update statement failed and one of the update statement successful, then in that case, we are not getting data consistency. For case number 3 and for case number 4, we do not have any issue, right? Why? Here, either all the statements are executed successfully or none of the statements are executed successfully. So in that case, whatever data we have before the transaction, we are getting the same data, or our data is in consistent level after the transaction, right? So if your data is in consistency level before the transaction as well as after the transaction, then there is no issue. When we are having the issue, when one of the update statement failed and when one of the update statement success, right? So in that case, we are having the we are having the data consistency issue. So basically, we need to take care these two scenarios, right? So we need to handle these two scenarios. So what we need to do, we need to either, right? So we need to check if any of the update statement failed, let me roll back the statement which are roll back the data which are modified by the transaction, right? So what we need to do, we need to use a transaction here, right? So let's say transaction start and let's say transaction end, right? So what do we need to do? We need to put this truth statement as part of the transaction, and then we will check. What we will check? Check whether all the statements are executed successfully. All the statements are executed successfully. All the statements are executed successfully. Yes or no? If yes, then commit the transaction, right? If no, then what you need to do? Roll back the transaction, right? So this is where you need to use transaction, right? So what basically transaction means? Transaction will ensure that either all the statements are executed successfully or none of them is executed successfully. If all the statements, all the DML statements are executed successfully, then it will commit the transaction. If any of the update statement failed, then it will roll back the transaction. Clear?
Yes.
This is where you need to use transaction. These are the 4 cases, right? That is what you need to handle. So what is a transaction? If someone asks you, a transaction is a set of operations, or you can say DML operations. So in this case, we are having multiple update statement. Update statement is nothing but a DML operation, right? Whenever we are having multiple DML, one update statement, no issue. 2 update statement, 3 update statement, 4 update statement, there will be some issue. And we need to put all those update statement as part of a transaction. And the transaction then will ensure that all the database operations are succeeded or all of them failed to ensure data consistency. What it means? It means the job is never half done. Either all of it is done or nothing is done. There should not be any scenario that one update is successful and another update is failed. Job is never half done. Either both the updates are going to be successful or none of them is going to be successful. Clear? Nice.
Yes, sir.
Right. So now we understand this is transaction, and we know how to implement a transaction in SQL Server database or in Oracle database, right? So we are not interested in how to implement transaction in SQL Server or how to implement transaction in Oracle, right? We are interested in how to implement a transaction in our C#.NET application, right? The way we are implementing the transaction, yes, transaction you can implement in the database level, that is fine, but it is also possible, right? It is also possible in ADO.NET level to implement the transaction, right? Then you might be one question, sir, why if we are able to implement the transaction at a database level, then why we are going to implement, right, the transaction at .NET application level, right? So two things. So if you are having independent update statement, right? So without PL SQL, you cannot implement a transaction in SQL Server, right? So if you are not creating a storage procedure, then how you can implement a transaction? Is that possible?
No.
Right? Because say in that is possible. But what we need to do, we need to start the transaction. Then we have to write multiple update statement. Then we will complete the transaction, right? But in this case, what will happen? We are going to call the update statement from our .NET application. So each update statement is going to be executed in the database, and by default, the transaction is going to be started once the update statement successfully executed, right? So guys, don't think that the transaction is not there, right? So suppose I'm writing this statement. Okay, don't go with the syntax, right? Let's assume this is my statement. So in this statement, do you think that is there any transaction is there? Is there any transactions? Yes, transaction is also there, right? By default, implicit transaction is there. That transaction is going to be applicable for each independent statement. Whenever you are going to execute this statement, one transaction will start. Once this statement executed completed, right? Completed, that means depending on whether this execution completed successfully or failed. If successful, then it will commit the transaction automatically. If failed, it is going to roll back the transaction, right? Similarly, if I'm having another update statement, right? For this update statement, again, it is going to do the same thing, right? Again, it is going to do the same thing for this update statement, right? It is going to start a new transaction. It is going to execute this statement. Once this statement is executed, right? Then again, it is going to roll back the transaction, right? So I would suggest guys to look my I have written many articles related to transactions, right? So please visit those, right? Please visit my website, right? Then you will find lots of useful articles related to transaction, and that is important, right? You should know how to implement transaction. If you go to this, then you will see there is something called storage procedure, right? So please visit my website. I'm sharing the URL also in the chat box, right? There where I'm explaining what is transaction, right? Not, this is not transaction, sorry. Where is the transaction? Yeah, you can see this is my transaction concept, right? Types of a transactions, right? Nested transaction. So all these things I have implemented. ये क्या हो रहा है? Right? So this is transaction, right? How to implement transaction, right? In SQL Server, please go and watch. And there is another important concept, auto commit transaction mode, implicit, explicit, right? These are the very important topics, right? That you should know as a developer, right? I'm putting the URL in the chat box. Please visit and try to complete the transaction concept from SQL Server. This is important, right? So now we'll come to our application, right? We understand what is transaction. Now let us see how we can implement transactions in ADO.NET, right? So the ADO.NET supports both single database transaction as well as distributed transaction. So what is the difference between a single transaction and a distributed transaction, right? Suppose you are developing one application, right? You are developing one application, right? And you are going to execute 4 update statements, right? You are going to develop 4 update statements. And let's assume that all these update statements or all these tables, right? Account to one, accounts 1, accounts 2, accounts 3, accounts 4. Let's assume that we are having 4 tables, right? And these 4 tables belongs to a single database. Belongs to a single database. So if it belongs to a single database, and if you are implementing transaction start, right? If you are implementing a transaction, then it is said to be a single database transaction, right? Now, what is the requirement now? So belongs to multiple databases. Multiple now the transaction belongs to multiple databases. In this case, these first 2 transactions are related to database 1, right? First 2 update statements are related to database 1. Second 2 update statements are related or belongs to database 2, right? In this case, right, it might be from the same database server, or it might be from the different database server, but 2 different databases, right? If you are implementing the transaction based on multiple databases, right, to ensure data consistency, then that is said to be your distributed transaction. So belongs to single database transaction. Multiple database means distributed transaction, right? Distributed transaction means the transaction is distributed between multiple databases. Clear, guys? What is a single database and what is distributed transaction? If the transaction that what you implement, whatever the DML operation you are performing as part of the transaction, if all the DML operations, right, are belongs to a single database, then that is said to be a single database transaction. If the transaction what you are implementing and if you are performing the DML operations belong to different databases, right, then it is said to be a distributed transaction. Clear? Clear, guys?
Yes.
Right. Right. The single database transaction is implemented using .NET managed provider, right? So whenever I'm saying .NET managed provider, then you have to remember what are the providers: system.data.sql client, system.data.oracle client, right? So by using those things, you can implement the single database transactions, right? Why using that .NET provider? You can implement a single database transaction, because in single database we are interacting with the single database, right? If the database is Oracle, then you can use Oracle data provider. If the database is SQL server, then you can use SQL data provider, right? But in the case of a distributed transaction, then you cannot use those data provider. Why you cannot use? It might be possible that first database is using SQL server, right? And the second database is using what you can say Oracle, right? Then in that case, can I use Oracle data provider communicate with the SQL Server database? Is that possible? I'm using SQL connection class. Can I communicate using SQL connection class? Can I communicate with the Oracle database, or for Oracle I need to use Oracle connection class?
You need a specific connection class.
Right? So guys, I think you guys are already forgot everything.
No, no.
Right? Say this is my .NET data provider. For SQL Server, the .NET data provider is SQL.data.sql client. For Oracle data provider, the data provider is SQL.data.oracle client, right? So if you want to communicate with the SQL Server database, then you have to use SQL client data provider. If you want to communicate with the Oracle, then you have to use Oracle client, right? Similarly, each connection command, data reader, data adapter, right? They are having specific connection, specific classes based on the data provider. If you are communicating with Oracle SQL server, you have to use SQL connection, SQL command, SQL data reader, SQL data adapter. If you want to communicate with Oracle database, you have to use Oracle command, Oracle connection, Oracle data reader, Oracle data adapter, right? So in the case of a single database, right? In the case of a single database means only one database you are going to communicate. Either you are communicating with the Oracle database, or you are communicating with MySQL, or you are communicating with the SQL Server database. Single database transaction means only single database will come into the picture. For that purpose, you can use .NET data provider, right? Specific to the database. But coming to the coming to distributed transaction means there is not a single database. There is multiple database, right? It's possible that the two databases are going to be same in some scenario, right? Let's assume that both the database might be in SQL Server, but it might be also possible that both the databases are in a different databases, right? So one database is using SQL Server, another database is might be possible that is going to be Oracle. Then in that case, if we are having two different databases, then how can we use the .NET data provider to implement this transaction? Is that possible? No, we cannot implement transaction using .NET data provider when we are going to implement a distributed transaction. And the reason is that if I'm using transaction specific to, right, transaction classes specific to SQL Server, then I can only implement transaction that is using uses SQL Server database. But if the transaction, one of the update statement uses SQL Server, another update statement uses Oracle, then how I can manage using SQL Server specific transaction? I cannot manage, or I cannot use Oracle specific transaction classes to implement distributed transaction. Why? It might be possible that other database in SQL Server, right? So for that purpose, we are going to use a different namespace, right? So for that purpose, we are going to use a different namespace, and that is system.data. The classes which are belongs to, right? No, sorry, that is system.transactions, right? For .NET managed, you are going to use system.data. For distributed transaction, you have to use system.transaction namespace, right? How to use, that is the next thing. But for now, you need to understand, if you are implementing single database transaction, you have to use system.data. And if you are using system distributed transaction, then you have to use system.transactions, right? So if you want to implement single database transaction, then you have to use one class called begin transaction, which is belongs to system.data namespace. And for distributed transaction, you have to use a transaction scope object, which belongs to system.transaction namespace, right? So here you need to understand the two things. One namespace is system.data and begin transaction, and this is basically used when you are interacting with single database transaction. Another one is a distributed transaction. For distributed transaction, you have to use one class called transaction scope, which belongs to system.transaction. What is begin transaction? How to use begin transaction? What is transaction scope? How to use transaction scope? We'll see in practical. Is that clear as of now, guys?
Yes.
Right. Let us first understand how to implement single database transaction using begin transaction, and then we will see the distributed transaction. For this purpose, right, I'm going to use this accounts table, which I am showing in the example, right? Let me create the database for this first, right? So I'm going to create a database called bank DB, and inside that bank DB, I'm going to add two accounts, right? One account name is account number is account one, account two, James Smith. Whatever I'm showing in the UI, that is what I'm creating here, right? So could not store, find storage procedure accounts two. Where is accounts two? Bank DB, let me delete this one. Right, so I'm creating the bank DB using bank DB. I'm creating the accounts table, account number, customer name, balance. Insert into accounts table, account number, customer name, balance. Everything is fine. Let me execute this statement. Why it is saying could not find storage procedure? Any other statement is there? No, no statement is there. Control X. And TP is not there. Create a database bank DB, use bank DB, create a table accounts, right? Insert into accounts table, right? Fine. Now, if you paste the data, then you will see the data as expected. So this is the data, what you can see in the UI, right? This is the data. We have created the database. And now I'm going to show you how to use begin transaction, right? Begin transaction class is basically used to begin the transaction, right? So here you need to understand the three things, right? So what are the things? Now, first of all, I need to begin the transaction, right? If all the statements are successful, right? All the statements are executed successfully, right? Then I need to commit the transaction, If anything goes wrong, right? If anything, right? If anything goes wrong, then we need to what? We need to roll back the transaction, right? So begin transaction class is basically used to begin the transaction, and once the transaction is begin, then we are going to update, right? We are going to execute the DML operations. We are going to execute the DML operation. If all the DML operations are executed successfully, then we need to commit the transaction. Once we commit the transaction, whatever changes made, right, whatever DML operations are executed, that is going to be executed permanently, or that is going to be updated the database permanently, right? If some of the execution, some of the DML statements are executed successfully, and some of the if at least one of the DML statement failed, right? Then in that case, it will throw an exception. Then in the catch block, what we need to do, we need to simply roll back the transaction, right? That means if everything is fine, then commit the transaction. If anything goes wrong, then roll back the transaction. This is what we are going to implement, right? So you can see this for understanding, for better understanding, please have a look at this diagram, right? Using SQL connection equals to new SQL connection string. No need to explain this thing, because right. So whenever you are going to communicate with a particular database, that database information you require, and that information you generally need store in the connection string, right? Once you store the data information on the connection string, so then using that connection string, you can create a connection object. This connection object is basically going to interact with this database, right? What you specified in the connection string. So, and guys, one more thing, the most important thing that you need to remember. So whenever you are using the transaction, right, before beginning the transaction, you need to open the connection. Before beginning the transaction, you need to open the connection. So in this case, you can see I'm first opening the connection. So connection dot open. So I'm not opening the connection while executing the query. I'm opening the connection before beginning the transaction. This is one of the important point that you need to remember. The connection needs to be opened before we begin a transaction, right? As we mentioned, right, we need to begin the transaction, then we need to execute the DML statement. So how we can begin the transaction? For beginning the transaction, you need to call the begin transaction method on the connection object, right? So this is my connection object, which is already open. On that opened connection object, I need to call the begin transaction method, and this begin transaction method, right, it is going to return me one connection or one SQL transaction, right? So you can see I'm storing that begin transaction object in the SQL transaction variable, and this transaction SQL transaction, what I'm using or what I'm showing here, right? It basically belongs to system.data namespace, right? So as I mentioned, so basically this begin transaction, right? All these things, whatever I'm going to show you, as it's a single database, it belongs to system.data namespace, right? So once you have start the transaction, right? This is your transaction object, which is the start date, right? Then inside the try and catch block, you can see inside the try block, I'm creating one SQL command object. And previously we have discussed the command object. We generally pass the command text, right? The command text or the storage procedure, if both we can set. So here I'm using the DML statement. Even you can also pass a storage procedure, right? And the second parameter is nothing but this command is going to execute on which connection, that connection object you need to pass. And importantly, you have to pass the transaction, right? So whatever transaction you have created, that you need to pass here, so that this update statement is going to be executed as part of this transaction. So once you provide this three information, then you need to call this method, right? So cmd.execute query, right? If this execution is completed successfully, then it will go to the next part. Otherwise, if this execution failed, right, then it will throw one error, and that error is going to be handled by this catch block. This is a generic catch block, and this catch block, finally what it is going to do, it is going to roll back the transaction. You can see transaction dot roll back, right? It is going to roll back the transaction, right? Let's assume that this CMD, right, this the first update executed successfully, it doesn't throw any kind of error, right? Then what will happen? It will go and execute the next statement, right? The next CMD statement, I'm updating the second update statement, right? I'm providing the second update statement as part of the command text. I'm using the same connection string and same transaction object. That means this update statement is also going to be executed as part of the transaction. Then I'm calling this execute non-query method. Let's assume that while executing the second update statement, some exception occurred, right? Then in that case, the catch block will go and the catch block will roll back the transaction. So when the catch block is roll back the transaction, so what it means, it means, so how many statements are executed as part of this transaction object successfully? One statement is executed as part of this transaction object successfully. Then that update statement will be rolled back, right? Whatever changes made, those are going to be rolled back. So this is the use of a rollback transaction, right? And if both statements are executed successfully, then it is going to commit the transaction. Once it commits the transaction, then whatever changes this update statement made to the database, those are going to be permanent, right? So if any of the update statement failed, it will execute the catch block. And if any update statement or insert statement or delete statement, right, executed successfully, those are going to be rolled back, right? If you are calling this commit method, these changes will be made permanently to the database. If you are calling the rollback, then these are going to be rolled back, right? Whatever balance value increase or decrease, that will be rolled back to the previous value. Clear, guys?
Yes.
Any question from anyone? Okay.
No.
Right. So these are the steps. Whatever I explained, you need to follow. First, you need to create and open the connection object, right? Then you need to start the transaction. Then you need to execute the command object. Then if everything goes well, then you need to commit the transaction. If everything not well, right? If something is issue, then you need to roll back the transaction, right? Now let us see these things with one example. So whatever example I have shown, right, I'm going to display those things practically, right? So in this case, you can see I'm basically creating two methods. Okay. So basically I'm creating two methods. One is get account data, and this is a very simple method. What this method is going to do, right? It is going to communicate with my bank database. it is going to fetch all the account data, right? And then by using the SQL data reader, it is going to print the account details. What is the account number? What is the customer name? And what is its balance? That is what is going to be printed by this get accounts data method. So everything we have already explained. We already know what is SQL connection. We know what is SQL command, SQL data reader, and what is this reader.read method. We have already know. You can access by using the column name, or you can also access by using the what integer index position. That is also possible, right? So this get accounts data is very straightforward, and the important thing, this is my money transfer method, right? So this method is basically going to transfer the account amount from one account number to a different account number, right? So let's say this is my step one, create the connection object, then open the connection object, right? The connection needs to be opened before we begin a transaction. This is the mandatory things. Then you need to open the transaction, right? You need to begin the transaction. How you can begin the transaction? Now by calling the begin transaction object. And once you begin the transaction, then you need to store that transaction object, right, in a SQL transaction variable, right? So this is a type, and within this type variable, you need to store the transaction. Why I'm storing the transaction? Because later I have to call either the commit method or rollback method on this transaction object. If everything goes well, then I need to call the commit method on this transaction object. If everything not well, right, then I need to call the rollback method on this transaction object. And this transaction object, right, whatever DML statement we are going to execute, everything we need to attach with this transaction object, or whatever statement we are going to execute, every statement should be executed as part of this transaction, right? And for that purpose, what I'm going to do, we need to pass this transaction object, or we need to attach this transaction with the command object. See, here I'm creating the command object. This is my update statement, right, which is going to update, right, the account balance by 500, where the account number is this one. See, whenever you are using some string value, you have to provide that string value within a single quote. For integer value, you can directly provide the value like this, right? And then I'm providing the connection object, and then I'm providing the transaction object, right? So in this case, what will happen, now this update statement is going to be executed on the database provided by this connection object, and this update statement will be executed as part of this transaction, right? So once if then I'm calling the execute non-query method as it's a DML statement. I do not need to use execute scalar or execute reader, right? So because it's a DML update statement, so I can execute this by using the non-query method. Then on the same command object, right, same command variable, I'm creating a new command object, and this command object is going to basically do the same thing, but in this case, it is going to add the account balance to the account number, right? Here, account number is a string variable value you have to provide it by using this single quote. Again, the same connection object and same transaction object, right? Then I'm again executing this command. Now, if both these update statements are successfully executed, that is fine. In that case, I need to commit this transaction, right? If either this execution failed, or if this execution failed, or while calling this, creating this command object failed, or while creating this command object failed, right? Anything happened, anything which is not good, right? Something goes wrong, right? Then in that case, the catch block is going to be executed. So in this case, it's a generic catch block. If you are confusing, then you can also use this thing, right? So this is the generic catch block. So whatever I'm writing, this is same as this, right? So don't confuse. So in the then, right, so if anything goes wrong, then you need to roll back the transaction, and at that time the transaction will be this message will be replayed, right? So what I'm doing from my main method, right? So from my main method, first of all, I'm calling the get accounts data method, which is going to display the data before transaction. What is the state of the data? Then I'm doing the transaction. After doing the transaction, I'm calling this get accounts data again to show whether the data is in a consistent state or not, right? Let me consistent state means whatever the total balance amount, that should be same, right? That should not be there should not be any changes, right? Let me run this application. right? Before transaction, you can see before transaction 1000, then transaction is committed, and then after transaction the value is 500 and 1500. That means our data is in a consistent state. Clear, guys?
Yep.
Right, now let's do one thing. Intentionally, what I'm trying to do, intentionally I'm going to modify the table name. So in the same, in case of accounts, I'm making this table as accounts 2. Is there any table accounts 2 in our database bank DB? Any table is there with the name accounts 2?
No.
No. That means while executing this update statement, it is going to throw some kind of an exception.
Correct.
Correct. So if it is throwing exception, then is this statement whatever written is going to execute, or it is going coming to the catch block?
Yes, catch block.
So in catch block, what it is going to do, it is going to roll back the transaction, right? If it is rollbacking the transaction, then this update statement which has already executed, right? This data is going to roll back, right? That means you will see 500 is not going to deduct. Again, it is going to be its previous state, right? Let me run the application and show you the data. Before transaction 500, 1500, after transaction also it is going to 500, 1500, and in this case you can see transaction rollback statement which we have written inside the catch block. Any question from anyone how to implement single database transaction? Guys,
Sir, one question, like, can we use SQL data adapter, like, which will, like, here we are opening the connection manually and operating on that. So,
see what I'm saying, right? So you have to open the connection here, right? Because why you are opening the connection here? You can also use data adapter, no issue, right? So what I'm saying, right? You have to open the connection here before beginning the transaction. The connection should be in open state. If the connection is not in open state, then that is not part of the transaction, right? And here you can execute any SQL statement, right? Here you can pass a storage procedure, that is fine. Right? See why you are going to use a data adapter when you are working with a disconnected architecture, right? So basically data adapter is basically used when you are fetching the data from the database, right or wrong? You want to fetch the data, you want to store that data, right, in a data set or in a data table, right? So guys, remember, whenever I'm saying DML operation, right? So DML operation means what are the operations? So one is insert, one is update, and another one is delete. Don't think that select statement is going to be your DML operation. So select means this is generally people are saying DRL, data retrieval language, right? So select is not a DML operation, right? And whenever you are using select statement, at that time you need to use data adapter, right? And using data adapter, whatever the result is written, right, that you need to store inside a what? Data set or data table, right? If I'm having a single update statement, right? If I'm having some insert statement or update statement or delete statement, right? Then what is the use of using data adapter? Is it required? I'm using a single insert statement. What it is going? Is it going to return me a data set? Or it is going to return me some result set? No. If it is not returning a result set or data set, then what is the use of using data adapter?
okay.
So what will happen if you want to update with the data adapter?
Sorry?
How will you handle updating the database with the data adapter with the
So,
update
see,
statement.
first of all, you just tell me that the data adapter object you created and that data adapter object having one method called fill. And that fill method, exactly, right? That fill method is going to execute the command, right? Open the connection, execute the command, retrieve the result, then store that result in the data table and data set, and then it is going to close the connection. If you are performing some update operation, then there is no need to use data adapter.
Okay.
So,
Okay, but the data adapter has a method which updates the database, right?
Data adapter is basically used whenever you are working with disconnected architecture, right? So disconnected architecture in the sense, if you want to fetch the data from the database stored in memory, and those in memory data, you are going to do some kind of operation, and then if you want, then you can update those data back to the database. Already we have seen this thing, right? So if
Okay, but you wouldn't use a transaction with the updates
see
of
in
the
this
data adapter.
See, in this case, if you see, I'm creating data table, right? And then I'm using the adapter.update, and in this case, it is going to be data table, right? So this is already available. So how to update the data using data adapter?
No transaction.
But in this case, you cannot update a single DML statement. In this case, you have to update the data table, right? Because data adapter base means it is going to work with your data set or data table, right?
Okay. So, one more question. Like the application that I'm working on, there is a facility. Actually, they have given extended plugins to like manipulate the data, like before the transaction and after the transaction, like pre-validation kind of thing. Like if there is a pre-validation plugin, then it will check some conditions, and if it won't satisfy, it will roll back the whole thing. So is it a part of
See, here I'm putting this condition, right, inside the catch block to roll back, right? So what I'm saying, if anything goes wrong, it doesn't mean whenever the exception is throwing, right? If anything goes wrong means you are validating something, right? If you are validating something, in this case, right, suppose I'm having some variable or some condition, right? So based on the condition also, you can commit the transaction, you can roll back the transaction, right? For example, if, right, suppose if, right, suppose I'm declaring one variable, let me condition that a value is there, some integer value, some value, right, some value equals to 10, right? I'm just giving a simple condition. If some value is, let me, this is the condition, is greater than 10, right? Then I need to commit the transaction, right? And else if some value else, I need to roll back the transaction, right? So roll backing the transaction means, it doesn't mean whenever it is throwing some kind of exception, right? It means if anything goes wrong, then we need to roll back the transaction. So you can check your condition. If condition is everything is fine, then you need to commit the transaction. If everything is not fine, then you can roll back the transaction. And this pre-checking condition, what you are showing, that you can create a method, you can call that method right from here, and if that method return true, then you need to commit the transaction. If that method not return true, then you can roll back the transaction. Got it? So see, I'm not mentioning that whenever some exception occurred, I need to roll back the transaction. Definitely, whenever the exception occurred, I need to roll back the transaction. But exception is one thing. But if anything goes wrong, then you need to roll back the transaction like this. Clear?
So is there any default like system created rollback functions in?
This is the system created rollback function. I'm not creating this rollback function. This
No,
is
no. I mean
already
like condition. Like suppose if like in
system.
application.
See, there is no system created rollback function that is in SQL Server, right? By default, if the transaction failed, it is going to roll back that transaction, but this is not a SQL Server. This is C#, right? There is no system created rollback function is provided, right? If you want, then you can see, if you go to the definition of this method, right? This is a overrideable method, right? So you can override, you can provide your own condition,
Okay.
right?
So only
This
in
is a
SQL
function
database.
method. So you can create your own class, right? Which is and there you need to override that method, and there you need to provide your own condition, right? And based on the condition, it is going to roll back the transaction. But that is not used, right, generally, but that is from the I mean from the many higher point of view, it need to rollback. I mean, you need to provide your own rollback functionality, right? But this is more than sufficient, because we just need to ensure that all the update statements are executed successfully. Then we need to roll back the transaction, and whatever condition you are saying that we can manually check. The rollback functionality means its only functionality is to check whether all the DML statements are executed successfully or not. If successfully executed, then we need to we need to commit the transaction. If not, then we need to roll back the transaction. And whatever conditional things you are saying that you can manually check, that should not be the part of your rollback transaction, right? So you can manually check those things, right? So see, what is the purpose of rollback and commit? That should not be changed. Commit means once all the DML operations are successfully, then you have to commit the transaction. And if you are checking that conditional checking, that you have to manage manually. If your condition is not satisfying, then why I'm going to execute this statement? You have to check those conditions, right?
So like suppose if not the case, like even though we can commit the transaction after a single update statement also, even though it is not according to our standards, like
See, first of all, you just tell me for single update statement, why transaction is required? If the statement executed successfully, automatically transaction, if you are having a single update statement, transaction is not required.
so transaction means like it is a complete execution of all the statements, which includes the like data. What is it? It should adhere to our data validation. I guess.
So basically, you want to execute a single update statement as part of your transaction. That is what you are saying, na?
Yeah, like can we do that?
So what is the
Suppose like,
what is the requirement? If you are having a single update statement, then there is no need to put that statement as part of the transaction. First of all, this. Why? Because by default, whenever you execute a single update statement, right, that is going to be executed as part of the transaction by default. Transaction is created, statement executed, completed, then it is automatically going to commit the transaction if the statement executed successfully, and it is going to roll back the transaction if the statement not executed successfully. But if you want to execute multiple update statement or insert statement or delete statement as part of a transaction as a single unit, then only you need to go with the transaction. Do you have any experience into transactions in SQL Server?
no, sir, but I have one scenario where we come across like to write.
No. So you should know this thing, right? What is auto implicit transaction? What is explicit transaction, right? What is implicit or transaction? What is auto committed transaction? You should know these things, right? Until and unless you do not know this thing, right, then you cannot understand this thing, right? So that is what I'm saying now. There are three types of transaction: auto committed transaction mode, right? One is implicit transaction mode. One is explicit transaction mode. If you do not know this thing, then you will not understand this. Auto committed transaction mode means what? Now the transaction is going to be automatically created. It is going to be automatically either committed or rolled back. Implicit transaction mode means the transaction is going to be created automatically, but as a developer, we need to commit the transaction. Explicit transaction mode means what? We need to create the transaction, we need to commit or roll back the transaction. How we can do this? That is what you need to know in SQL Server, right? So if you are executing a single update statement, then this is the thing is going to be happen. Automatically the transaction is going to be created, execute the DML operation, then automatically if the operation completed successfully, it will commit, else it will roll back. Right?
Okay, sir. Got it.
Right? Because these things are not new, right? And these things, whatever we are saying now, this is completely related to the database. And whatever happening in the database side, this the same thing is going to be happening in here, right? So we are rollbacking the transaction, means the rollback command is going to be executed in the database only, right? Any question from anyone, guys?
Come back to sorry, but I really need to understand this. If you have an update with the
Sorry?
adapter, let me come back with this, excuse me. But if you have an upgrade, an update, sorry, with that adapter, so that would be a transaction. I mean, either the whole table updates or nothing updates. Is that right?
See, so also you mean you want to create one data adapter object, which is going to execute the update statement, right?
Right. So when I do the update statement, it's either updates the whole table or it doesn't update anything. Is that right?
See, that is also possible. Let me create one object of SQL data adapter, right? And go to the SQL data adapter constructor, right? So you can see this is, there is no chance, right? There is no chance to pass the transaction object.
And what happens if it fails?
Right? SQL command the transaction, right? Initial batching, right? So there is no chance. So basically, why you are going to change the default functionality, right? So for updating, you can update as a batch, right? And if you want, then you can put those statement as part of the transaction. But I don't know how to use the transaction with the SQL data adapter, right? That is what you need to do some R&D, right? Or I need to do some R&D. Okay, that should be some scenario, right? SQL data adapter with transaction in C#, right? I never used those things. Let me open this thing. Right? See, you have to do some kind of R&Ds, then only you will able to know this thing. Right? SQL connection, transaction is, see, here again he is doing the same thing, right? Here he is creating the connection string object, opening the connection, right? Then he is executing this begin transaction, and then he is using this data adapter object, right? The same thing. You understood?
Okay.
You understood or not? So
Yeah,
basically, you have
so
to.
it doesn't work by itself. It doesn't work by itself because I was wondering what happened if you try to update the whole table, right? When you say
See,
update,
in
the
this
whole
case,
thing goes up. But if
see,
anything fails, what happens? Okay, you can put it within a transaction. Okay.
so everything you need to put within the transaction, right? And you have to open the transaction before beginning. That is what here it is doing the same thing, right? Then using SQL data adapter, whatever operation you do, you can do, right? And finally, after the operation, either you have to commit or you have to roll back. And which statement is executed based on that statement, either the updation is going to be successful or it is going to be failed. Clear?
Okay, thanks. Yeah.
Right, the same thing, right? It is, so in this case, whenever you are calling this fill method, it is going to open, right? It is going to open the connection string, right? Execute the this command and whatever thing that is going to be happen, but those are not permanent. Why it is not permanent? Because it is executing as part of the transaction, right? So you can see here I'm putting that in this statement, you can observe, select. So in this case, in our example, I have shown you while I'm performing the batch operation. Okay, let me show you these things practically.
Yeah, maybe when you are filling the data table is not that well, it's always important, but what I mean is not that important, but
Yeah,
it's
filling
more
the- see-
important when you try to update the database.
Exactly.
That's when it goes.
Exactly what I'm saying. Now, whenever you are performing the DML operation, filling the data table is not important, because if you are filling the data table, the data is not going to be updated in the database, right? So what is our objective? Our objective is the data storing in the database should be consistent data, right? Filling the data table is not a part of update statement, right? So in that case, okay, let me show you that example. I'm not going to execute, because for this I need to create the database, but I just need to show you the statement, right? Right. This is my table, right? I'm filling the right. So what you need to do, first of all, you need to open the connection, right? Then SQL transaction, right? SQL transaction equals to connected begin transaction, right? This is the transaction object you have created, right? And in this case, this is your insert command, right? So what you need to do here, adapter dot insert command, right? Dot transaction. You need to attach your transaction, right? Now your insert command, right? What is going to be executed by your data adapter is going to execute as part of this transaction, right? Now you are having some update command here, right? Then what you need to do, you need to attach to your update query with as part of the transaction, right? You are having the delete command. Again, what you need to do, you need to attach, right, your command with the transaction, right? How you can do this? You just need to call this delete command method, and you are attaching this, right? Now your update statement is going to be executed, right? And this employee data table is going to be, some of the data is going to be updated, some of the data is going to be deleted, some of the data is going to be inserted, right? And if anything goes wrong, right, then now you can write this statement as part of the try catch block, right? And if anything after executing this thing, right, then what you can do is you can call the transaction.commit method. And if something goes wrong, right, then in that case you can call the rollback method. Clear?
Excellent.
Yeah.
Right. So but the thing, whatever I'm saying again and again, the connection should be open before starting the transaction, right? So if I'm using the command object, right? So in the command object, okay, let me show you the example again, right? So because this is nothing new, right? We are working with this example, right? So if I'm working with this example, right? In this example, you can see I'm passing the transaction object as a parameter to the command object, right? So even though if I comment this, right, cmd dot transaction, I can also do the same thing. What is I'm doing with the SQL data adapter? I'm doing this thing, right? In that case, I'm attaching the, in this case, I'm attaching the command object with the transaction. In that case, I'm creating the SQL adapter object. Then in the command text, I'm attaching this thing, right? So again, same thing you can do here, right? So you can pass the transaction as a parameter to the constructor. If not passing, then you can attach the transaction to the command object, right? And this is what, if you see this example, right? So if you look at this example, right? Right. So in this case, if you look at this, so I'm creating the data adapter object, right? This is my data adapter object, and I'm attaching the command object, and after then I'm attaching the transaction to the command object. This is the same thing, right? So in this way, you can attach the transaction. Any question from anyone else?
It's okay. Thank you. Very well.
Okay. So the next important thing of what we are going to discuss is this is single database transaction, and we are also having the concept called what is distributed transaction. This is also important, right? So you need to understand what is distributed transaction, right? Because people are not aware about this thing, right? They do not know how to implement a distributed transaction because they mostly work on a single database, and for single database, single transaction is fine, right? But it is also possible that you can work with a distributed transaction. So we have already discussed single database transaction implement using begin transaction, which belongs to system.data namespace, right? And now we are going to keep focus on the distributed transaction, right? Which uses transaction scope object. And in this case, this transaction scope object belongs to system.transaction namespace. What is a distributed transaction means what? We have already explained the theories, right? Now, if your transaction is going to be execute the DML operation on more than one databases, and if you want to ensure the unit atomicity or consistency, right, between multiple databases, then you need to use distributed transactions, right? So this is what. A distributed transaction is a transaction which uses different data sources, or in simple word, we can say that the transaction going to perform DML operation on more than one databases. Distributed transaction allows to perform several operations on different systems, or you can say different databases, right? But as a single unit, right? Either succeeded or failed completely, right? If you are not clear at this moment, don't worry, we'll try to understand, right? So basically, we are going to understand this by taking one example, right? So we are going to use two different databases, right? You might be, you can create both the databases in different server, or you can create the both databases in the same server, right? So I'm going to show you, I cannot use different server because my SQL server is it's a local machine, right? So in that case, what I'm going to do in my SQL server, right? I'm going to create two databases. One is Axis Bank DB and another one is ICICI Bank DB, right? And I'm going to perform the DML operation, right? By using these four tables, right? So what is my requirement, right? I want to implement the same bank transfer functionality, right? And in this case, what will happen now, whenever I'm transferring the account, right? Whenever I'm transferring some money from this account table, okay, forget about the transfer functionality. Let me first explain you these things, right? So these things means, as you know, from your account, you can perform some kind of a deposit functionality, some kind of withdraw functionality, some kind of a bank transfer functionality, right? So whenever I'm adding some amount, right? That amount is going to be added into my account balance, but that information is going to be stored in this table, right? So for example, account number 1001 added some amount. So in that case, so transaction details said it's a unique ID. It is going to be the account number, for which account number this record is all about. How much amount he added, transaction default, it is deposited or withdrawn, transaction time, it is CR on which date, right? So for example, you can say for account number 1001. So for account number 1001, how many records are there in this table? Two records is there. First, it is deposited 7,000 and then it is withdraw 2,000. So 7,000 minus 2,000, what is the total amount? Total amount is going to be shown here. Again, suppose I'm adding some amount 5,000 to this account 1001. Again, a new row will be entered here with the status deposit, transaction type as CR, and whatever date, and that balance it is going to be show here is 10,000, right? And this is the same case for account number 2. So you can see account number 2 current balance is 6,000, and for account number 1002 we are having two records. One is 9,000 deposited and another one is 3,000 deposited. So if I this minus operation plus minus, so 9,000 minus 3,000, it is going to be 6,000, which is his current balance, right? and this is my ICICI Bank database, right? So for simplicity purpose, I'm making, right, I'm putting those uh, both of this bank signature as same, right? But you can also create a different structure, right? So in this case, account number, instead of account number, you can give a different column name, number, a customer account number, anything, right? And here in this, instead of 3 columns, you can add 5 columns, no issue. Here, instead of 6 columns, you can also add 7, 8 columns, no issue, right? So why it is possible? Because it's a completely different database. But for simplicity purpose, I'm putting the signature as same, but you can also create a different signature, right? And here also the functionality is going to be same. Whenever I'm deposited some amount, the transaction detail is like this. If I'm withdrawing some amount, then this is the transaction details. While I'm withdrawing, first of all, the amount balance is going to be deducted. Once it is deducted, then that information is going to be stored here. So apart from these two, I'm going to introduce another transaction type, that is, you can say, what is the transaction type? Transfer, right? So for transfer, what is the type I have taken? Let me see the code, CR, right? So okay, another type, what I'm taking transaction details as a transfer, and the transfer, suppose I'm doing the transfer, then from this account, from account from account 1001 from Axis Bank DB, I want to transfer some amount to a different user from ICICI Bank DB, right? From James account, I want to transfer some amount 1000 to Sarah's account, from James account in Axis Bank, and Sarah's account is in ICICI Bank. Then in that case, so while I'm transferring 1000 from this account, so this account balance, James account balance, is going to be 4000. One record will be inserted here. It is saying that 51001 1000, and here transaction detail is going to be transfer, and the transaction type is going to be DR, because the amount is going to be debited from this account and the transaction detail. And at the same time, the Sarah account balance is going to be increased by 1000. It should become 1600, and another details is going to be inserted here, saying that 5, and what is the account number, 50001, amount is 1000, and here transfer, and here the transaction type is as CR. CR means it is credited. So this is what I'm going to implement, but I'm going to implement this functionality as part of a transaction. And as you can see, both are having two different databases. So I cannot use a single database transaction, right? It might be possible that this database is SQL Server database. This database might be in Oracle databases. So I cannot use that .NET data provider. So basically, I'm going to use the namespace called the transaction, the system.transaction, right? Understand what is our requirement?
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Right. So let me first create the databases, and then I'll show you the things. Right. So this script is very simple and very straightforward. Right. So let me first delete those things. Axis Bank DB, and then ICICI Bank DB. Right. So you can say, first I'm creating the Axis Bank database, right? I'm using the Axis Bank database. Inside Axis Bank, I'm creating the accounts table, adding 2 accounts, right? That account details, I need to log into the transaction details table. I'm creating the transaction details table with the required columns. You can see I'm making this account number as a foreign key, which is referring to the account number of our account table. So here account number is the primary key, and here account number is the foreign key, right? Then I'm inserting some data into the transaction details table, right? Then I'm creating the ICICI Bank DB, right? I'm using the ICICI Bank DB.
I'm creating a table in the ICICI Bank TB. I'm entering 2 accounts into the ICICI Bank TB. I'm creating the transaction details table. Again, you can see the account number is the primary, is the foreign key, which is pointing to the accounts table account number, right? So this is my foreign key. So I am executing this query and then I'm entering few records into the account transaction details table. So our database is ready. Right now, you can verify those 4 statements, right? Where is that skill? Okay. Right. So let me open this thing, select, right? Select a star from Axis Bank DB dot, what is the table name? Account. Right. Right. So Axis Bank DB dot accounts table. Why invalid object name Axis Bank DB? Okay. So this is my Axis Bank database, right? Then I'm going to use other tables as well. What is the other table? The other table is transaction details, right? Then I'm going to check the details of my ICICI Bank TB. Right? I'm going to execute all the statement at once, right? So now you can see this is my account number of Axis Bank. This is the transaction details. This is the account number of ICICI Bank. And this is the transaction detail. Whatever I'm showing in the UI, right? All these things are created. So our database part is ready, right? Now we want to implement the money transfer functionality, right? So what is discussed, right? That is what we want to implement, right? How to implement. So we want to basically implement what functionality. Now we want to transfer the money from this account number to this account to number, right? And while I'm transferring, the amount should be deducted here. That information should be stored in this transaction details table. The amount should be added to this account, and that information should be stored inside this transaction details table. This is what I need to implement, as I'm going to use 2 different databases. So I need to use distributed transaction, right? So distributed transaction means what? Now you have to use, whenever you are using multiple databases, then you need to go with the distributed transaction, right? So system.transactions introduced in .NET Framework 2.0, right? So it is introduced in .NET Framework 2.0, which allows us to implement distributed transaction, that is transaction across different data sources. This transaction namespace provide one class called the transaction scope, right? We are going to use this class, this transaction scope class, to manage the distributed transaction, right? So in order to create and use distributed transaction, first of all, we need to create an instance of a transaction scope object and specify whether you want to create a new transaction or you want to use one existing transaction, right? So basically, if you already one transaction is created, you can use that transaction, or if you want to create a new brand new transaction, that also possible, right? So basically, we are going to show you how to create a new transaction. It is also possible to open multiple databases connection within the same transaction scope. So basically what we are going to do is, so currently we are having 2 databases, right? 2 databases means we are having 2 different connections. So using the same transaction scope, I'm going to open 2 different database connections. The transaction scope will decide whether to create a local transaction or distributed transaction. So what it means if you are using a single database, if you are having a single connection object, right, as part of the transaction scope, then it will treat it as a local transaction, right? But if you are using multiple connection, right, if you are opening a multiple connection as part of the transaction scope, then it is automatically convert that local transaction to a distributed transaction. Local transaction means only one database involved in the transaction. Distributed means if you are involving multiple transaction, right? If you open a single connection, then it will be a single transaction. And when you open subsequent connection within the transaction scope, then the transaction scope promote that transaction to distributed transactions. Clear?
Yes.
So basically what it means, basically it means depending upon the connection, right? So if you are communicating with the database one, then you need connection one object. If you are communicating with the database two, then you need database two connection object. If you are opening a single connection as part of a transaction scope, then it is a single transaction. If you are opening a multiple connection as part of the transaction scope, then it will automatically promote that single transaction to distributed transaction, right? So that is what. Now we need to understand how to create a distributed transaction in .NET. So basically, we need to follow 5 steps to create the distributed transaction in .NET. First, what are the steps? First, you need to create an instance of a transaction scope. And this transaction scope is basically going to manage the distributed transaction. Second step, you need to open the connection. Third, you need to perform the DML operations, right? And if all DML operations are completed successfully, then mark the transaction as completed. And if they are not, then you have to then you have to dispose the transaction. See, here you need to remember one thing. We'll say this is not difficult. We'll create one transactions class object. We'll open the connection. We'll perform the DML operation. If all DML operations are completed successfully, then we need to mark the transaction as completed, right? So transaction as completed. But here you will not find, or here you will never see that you need to mark the transaction as failed. This thing is not available, right? And once here you only need to mark that the transaction is completed by calling some method. What method that we will see? And then you need to dispose the transaction scope object. But here you might be one question. What is the question, sir? Here I'm marking the transaction as completed. Then I'm marking the I'm disposing the transaction scope object. Then how will it make sure whether the transaction is rolled back or not, right? So whenever you are disposing the transaction object, then at that time he will check whether the transaction is marked as completed or not. If it is marked as completed, then it is going to call the commit transaction, right? It is going to commit the transaction. If he will see that the transaction is not marked as completed and you are disposing the object, then it will roll back the transaction, right? See, if all the DML operations are succeeded in a transaction, then call the complete method, right? If then you need to call the complete method on the transaction scope object to indicate the transaction completed successful, right? If all the operations are completed, in this case 4 DML operations are completed. If 4 DML operations are completed, then you need to call this complete method. How to call? Now using this transaction scope object, you need to call this complete method, and this will mark the transaction as completed successfully. Then how to terminate the transaction? Simply, you need to dispose this object, right? So to terminate the transaction, we need to call the dispose method on the transaction object. When we call the dispose method on the transaction object, then the transaction is either committed or rollback, right? Depending on the complete method, right? So what it means, right? So whenever we are disposing the transaction scope object, then the transaction is going to be completed, right? It's going to be terminated. Then the transaction is either going to be terminated with committed or terminated with rollback. And this basically depends on the complete method, right? See, if your all DML operations are completed, you call this complete method. And if you call this complete method, then the transaction is going to be completed by calling this committed transaction, right? If you are not calling this complete method, then the transaction is going to become terminated with rollback. See, if you call the complete method on the transaction scope object before its disposal, the transaction manager commits the transaction. If you did not call the complete method on the transaction object before its disposal, the transaction manager roll back the transaction. So it's basically whether the transaction is going to be committed or the transaction is going to be rolled back completely depend on this complete method. And this complete method is provided by this transaction scope class. Once you call this complete method means the transaction is going to be committed, and if you are not calling this complete method means the transaction is going to be rolled back. Clear? Clear, guys? If not clear, don't worry. Once we see this, once we see this thing practically, you will your concept will be clear, right? A transaction scope defines a block of code that participate in a transaction. What is transaction scope? It's a class which defines a block of code that participate in a transaction, and as part of that block of code, right, you can communicate, you can open multiple connection object, you can communicate with multiple databases as part of that scope, right? If the code block completed successfully, right, then the transaction manager commits the transaction. Otherwise, the transaction manager roll back the transaction. To use a transaction scope, you need to add a reference to the system.transaction assembly, right? See, okay. So in my application, let me go to the solution explorer, right? So go to the reference folder. Is there any DLL which is referred to system.transaction? Yes. By default, you will not find this one, right? By default, you will not find this one. Then what you need to do, you need to go to the add reference folder, right? In add reference folder, you can see we are having project, we are shared, we are having home, we are having browse, right? This option. So go to the assembly folder, and if you go to the assembly folder, there something you will find system.transactions, right? System.transaction. System.transaction. See, this is the DLL or assembly. You need to include this DLL into your project. Select this system.transaction, click on the OK button. Right. Once you include this, then you can use the system.transaction namespace. Clear? How to use this system.transaction? First of all, you need to include the assembly, then you need to use the naming space, right? Now let's see this whatever explained, right? Whatever we have discussed, let us see these things practically, right? So you can see, okay, let me minimize this, right? So first of all, you need to add that namespace system.transaction, and you have to include the system.dlr, right? So this is my connection string, which is pointing to Axis Bank, and this is my connection string, which is pointing to ICICI Bank. So basically, I'm going to perform DML operation on two different databases, and for that purpose, what is required or what is mandatory is transaction scope. So here you can see I'm using the transaction scope, right? As part of this transaction scope, as I'm using this, I'm creating this transaction object, right? As part of this using a block, that means when this block execution completed, this transaction scope object, right, it is going to dispose automatically, right? So whenever we are using the using block and creating one object, right, that object is going to be disposed automatically whenever the using block is complete its execution, right? So at this moment, right, at this statement, the transaction scope object is going to dispose, and when it is disposed, right, at that time, either it has to call the commit method or it has to call the rollback method, depending on whether you call the complete method on this transaction scope object or not, right? So now let's go inside, right? So first of all, I'm creating one connection object, right? This connection object, right, is pointing to which database? Axis Bank database, right? And then what I'm trying to do, I'm creating one command object, right? What command object? Why I'm creating command object? Because I want to execute some update statement. And to this command object, I'm adding this connection Axis Bank, right? So here you can see I'm attaching this command object with the connection, and then I'm opening the connection. And then I'm adding the command text. I'm executing the command text, right? Whatever update statement I'm executing here, right? And this execute non-query is going to return me the number of rows affected by this command, right? If it is affected, right? And then I'm executing the other command text, right? So basically, if you know, or if I'm going to deduct the money, right? Okay, so suppose I want to deduct the money from this account, then first of all, I need to deduct this account balance, and then I need to store that information in this transaction table. So one update statement and the other one is going to be a insert statement. See, first of all, I'm updating the account balance by 1000, where account number is 1001. So for James account, I'm deducting 1000, right? And the second is that I'm going to insert that information into the transaction details table. And in this case, I'm inserting the data by making this as a transfer. And transfer means it is going to be debited. So I'm marking that type as a DR. So this is my two update statement, right? One update statement, one insert statement. This is going to be executed on my Axis Bank, right? So if both these statements are executed successfully, right, that means these rows affected by DA and the rows affected by DB, right, both are going to return me a value greater than 1, right? If one update statement is successful, it return 1. If the insert successful, it is going to return me 1. So in that case, I'm putting this condition. What condition I'm putting? I'm putting if this value is greater than 0 and this value is greater than 0, then only go inside. Otherwise, mark this transaction as failed. Clear? Up to now, any question from anyone?
Yeah, I'm having one question.
What is?
Why we are using two usings? Actually, in the top we are using a one using. There we have a SQL connection. Another then we are using.
See, if you are using this using connection, that means this transaction scope is going to be disposed automatically when this using block completed. Right? If I'm creating the connection string like this, right? Suppose I'm not using the using block. I'm creating the connection string, right? Like this, right? And if I'm opening the connection, right? If I'm opening the connection, then I have to call the close method here, right? Because this is not going to automatically close, because this is not created using the using block. This is created using the using block, means this transaction scope is going to automatically dispose automatically whenever this completed. But this is not part of the using block. So here you are calling opening the close, calling the open method means manually you need to close call the close method.
Okay, got it.
But if you put this thing within the using block means what? Now it is automatically it is automatically going to be destroyed, right? This is the reason why you can see always it is suggestible to use whenever you are creating any heavy resource, right? It might be possible that you forget to dispose the object, right? And but in this case, whenever you goes out of the scope, automatically the object is going to be disposed. Clear?
Yeah, clear.
So you can see not only I'm using this transaction scope, I'm using this SQL command, SQL connection, everything. Up to now, this is clear, right? Now, if both of these update statements are right, if any of the update statement is successful or one of the update insert statement is failed, right? If any of the DML operation is failed, then in that case, this condition is going to be failed. And in that case, I'm just marking this transaction as failed. And from this statement, it will dispose the command object, it will dispose the connection object, and it will dispose the transaction scope object. And when it disposes the transaction scope object, then it will check, is there any method whose name is complete is called on this transaction scope object? Did we call that complete method on this transaction scope object? No, we have not called. Then what he will do, he will roll back the transaction, right? If one of the update statement is successful, that will be rolled back. If update failed and insert successful, then that insert is also going to be rolled back. But let's assume both the DML operations are successfully executed. Then in that case, it is returning 1, it is returning 1. and that means this else part will not execute. It will go inside the if block. Clear? Right? Any question from anyone? Guys?
No.
No, we don't have any.
No, it's
Right.
fine.
Right. So now within this block, now I'm going to say once the money is deducted from this account, then we need to add that money into the account of this user which is on a different bank, right? That means we need to create a different SQL connection object, right? So whenever we are creating this SQL connection object, right, now it will convert this transaction to a distributed transaction. Until now, this is not a distributed transaction. Until now, it is a single database transaction. But whenever I create a different connection object as part of the transaction scope, it will automatically convert that single transaction to a distributed transaction. Clear?
Yeah.
Right? So now I'm going to create the connection object which is pointing to my the ICICI Bank. I'm creating a command object where I'm going to execute the command on ICICI Bank, right? Then I'm making the connection object pointing to this connection string. Then I'm opening the connection object, right? Then I'm setting the command text, and in this case the command text is nothing but it is going to update the account balance by 1000, right? And then I'm executing the calling the non-query method, which is return me one integer number, indicating one means it is executed successfully, other than zero means it is not executed. Of any exception, that is other thing, right? And in this case, I'm again inserting that transaction details into the transaction details table of ICICI Bank, right? If both these two statements are executed, then it is going to return me one, and it is also going to return me one. Let's assume that one of the statement failed. Let's assume that this execution completed, but this execution failed. Then in that case, this rows affected D, it is going to return me zero, right? In that case, this condition is going to be failed. If this condition is failed, then the else block is going to be executed, and it will mark this transaction as failed. Then it will dispose the command object, it will dispose the connection object, and it will dispose the Axis Bank command object, Axis Bank connection object, and it will finally dispose the transaction scope object. And when it dispose the transaction scope object, it will check whether the complete method is called on this transaction scope object or not. And at this time, you can see that complete method is called, so it will roll back the transaction. Now, let's assume that both the operations are completed successfully. It is executed successfully, it is also executed successfully, means it is returning me one, it is returning me one. Then at that time, these two statements are going to be, this condition is going to be true, and in that case, it will go inside. And inside this method, you can see I'm calling this complete method, right? This complete method mark the transaction as completed, and whatever message you want to print, you can print. And with this complete method, right, this block is completed, then it will dispose this command object, connection object, Axis Bank command object, Axis Bank connection object, and transaction scope object. And while disposing the transaction scope object, it will check whether the complete method on this transaction object is called or not. Now you can see the complete method is called. That means the transaction is completed successfully, and he will call this commit method. And once he call this commit method, then whatever changes we have made to the database, right? This update, this insert, right? This update, this insert, all the changes are going to be made permanently in the database. Clear, guys? Or anyone having any question? Guys?
Yeah, it's clear.
Right? Now if you run the application, then you will see that the data as expected, right? If everything is fine, then it should deduct the money, it should log the transaction information in the transaction details. See, 1000 deducted from account number 1001 from Axis Bank, 1000 deposited to the account number 5001 to ICICI Bank, transaction completed. That means currently this is my database details. Let me take this one, open a new window, execute these things, right? So previously, what is the account balance? 5,000 and 15,000. Now it should be 4,000 and 1600. Is that clear? 1600, right? Now there are two entries for this account number 1001. Now it should be a new entry, and the new entry indicate that you are transferring amount to 1000, right? That is information, and it's a type of a DR, means it is debited, right? And for the other account, right, Sarah, it should have a new entry into this transaction details table, and it should show me that the transaction is credited, right? So you can see transfer, and the type is going to be CR credit. Clear, guys?
There.
Right.
Yeah.
Now
Yes,
what I'm trying to do, I'm intentionally going to do some mistakes, right? So intentionally going to do some mistake means what I'm trying to do, I'm making this value as 5, right? I'm making this value as 5. So I know this method is going to return me 1, but in this case, so 1 is greater than 5. This condition is going to be satisfied or failed?
only
Guys,
float.
sorry.
It will not.
So
Failed.
in this case, the condition is going to be failed. Yes or
Yes,
no?
yes,
In this case,
Yes.
even though for all the object statements are executed, but in this case, we are not calling the complete method, because we are intentionally making this condition to fail, so that we are not going to call this complete method. Then at that case, you will see that the transaction failed message, and it should roll back the transaction, right? Let me run this application. See, deducted from account number and transaction failed, right? Once the transaction failed, it will roll back the details, right? And you will see, okay, let me run update this one, and you will see. So previously 4,000, 6,000, now 4,000, 6,000. Any new entry in the transaction details table? No, because already we have 5 entries, right? No more transfer or type DR, and you can say no more transfer with type DR. And here also no more transfer with type CR. That means in this way, based on this complete method, right, it is going to decide whether the transaction is going to be committed or the transaction is going to be rolled back. Clear? Or anybody having any question, they can ask me now. Guys,
It's clear.
yeah.
It's
See,
clear.
this is the thing that you need to understand related to transaction, how you can implement single database transaction and how you can implement a distributed transaction, right? So few more concepts are left in ADO.NET, right? What is connection pooling, right? What is data view? What is the architecture? And once we discuss connection pooling and data view, right? Then we'll discuss the architecture of ADO.NET, and with that, we'll conclude our ADO.NET sessions. And mostly tomorrow I'm going to complete this thing, right? Because these are the important things. You should know what is happening and how these things are happening, right? You will not find this thing from anywhere, right? No, if you are looking at the internet, right? If you are watching the YouTube channel, nobody is going to explain this distributed. Mostly they are explaining the single database transaction, but they will never explain, or you will not find, or you will find very limited resources for this kind of things, right? So whatever the bulk operation functionality we have implemented, right? Using storage procedure, using SQL bulk copy, right? Using SQL data adapter object method, right? These are the things which you generally will not find on internet, right? If you find, then that is not going to be the completed one. Bit and pieces they are providing the information, right? And once we discussed these things tomorrow, once we complete, then we will take a break, right? Break means you need to do practices, because I have given one task. Until now, I'm not getting the output. Guys, did anyone try how to make a generic method, right? Where I'm passing the storage procedure, and that method is going to return me one object value. Did anyone try that? That means you guys are not doing practices. right? So you have to do practices, because if you are not doing practices, right, then you will not understand many things, right? So for example, suppose I'm showing the transaction using this command object, right? And if you want to know how to implement a transaction using SQL data adapter, right, then how you will do this? You have to do some kind of practices. You need to do some kind of R&Ds. It is not possible that every concept I can explain in the classroom, right? What is important, what is necessary, most of the concept I'm going to explain. But apart from that, many things are also there that you need to do practice, and that you will come to know when you are going to do the practices. If you are not doing practices, then you will not understand this. One good question come today: how you can implement a transaction in a SQL data adapter, right? So you will only come to know this question, or this question will come to your mind whenever you are doing the practices, right? Suppose you are doing some SQL data adapter example, then only at the time that this thing should strike to your mind. Yeah, if I'm doing this thing, then how I can maintain that transaction in this example? Is it possible? Is it possible to implement the transaction or not? If implement possible, then how we can implement the transaction? If not possible, then why not possible? What is the issue, right? These things will come into the picture when only you are going to do the practices, right? Another good question comes by Bhargav, that how I can commit or roll back the transaction based on the condition, right? It is not always that some exception occurred, then only you are going to commit the transaction, or you are going to roll back the transaction. That is the reason why here I'm not throwing any exception, right? I'm not making this transaction table to 2, right? So I'm not making this here. Based on the condition, I'm going to complete the transaction. Suppose you are executing one storage procedure. So instead of a SQL statement, you can also call one storage procedure. As part of the storage procedure, you might be doing some kind of activities. So instead of one update statement, another update statement, you can put all these things within a single storage procedure, and you can call that storage procedure from here, and that storage procedure is going to return some value, right? Some value one indicate that execution completed successfully. Some value 0 indicate that there is some issue in the database side, right? And based on the 1 and 0 value, if you want to maintain, if you want to make sure that the transaction is completed or not, then that you can do here, right? So it is not always possible that whenever the exception arises, I need to roll back based on your own condition. So in this example, right, what is the task for you guys today is, in this example, in this distributed example, I have used command text, right? The plain text. You need to convert this example to storage procedure. So instead of a command text, you need to pass the storage procedure name, and in that time you have to provide that command type as storage procedure. And I don't want two command text. I want a single storage procedure, and that single storage procedure should going to perform this two update statement, and that storage procedure is going to return me some value indicating whether the operation is successful or not. That is what the task is given to you guys, and you have to complete that task, um, right? And along with this task, you have to complete the previous task what I have given. Otherwise, I'm not going to start entity framework, because it's not like that. I'm always going to do the practices. I'm going to make the examples. But if I'm giving you some task, then I also need to be. I, I also need to make sure that you guys are understanding the concept. And when I will make sure that you guys are understanding the concept, whenever I'm giving some task, and if you are successfully implementing the task, right? If you are facing some issue, most welcome. Why? Because if you are not facing the problem, then you will not become a developer. If you are facing the problem, means you will definitely understand the concept, and that guarantee I can give you. If you are having issue, I will help you definitely. I will take some time. I will go through your code. I will make sure to understand the code, what wrong is in your code, how you can rectify those things. I will help. But for that purpose, for that thing, first of all, you need to practice. You need to start the development. You need to start the programming. You need to do the task, whatever I'm assigning to you, right? So these are the two examples, right? So what basically you need to do is you need to prepare the example, right? And you need to prepare the document like this, right? So in that document, yeah, you can use my database, whatever structure I'm providing, same structure you can use, right? But the code, whatever you written, that you need to put in a text file and you need to submit that text file in the Telegram group so that anybody can view that file. If you are having some issue, then you can also point out, I'm facing some issue. I need help. Is anybody available who can help me? Right? Even I'm not available, then if anybody available in the group, right, who have completed the task, then that person can help other person. It is not always like that I'm going to help you. Right? Some other person are also there who can help you in this group. Right? Clear, guys?
Yes.
Right? What is the task you guys understood?
Instead of the plain query, we have to do the same in the procedure.
Yeah, storage procedure, but I don't want a two storage procedure. Within a single storage procedure, you have to perform these two operations.
Okay.
Right? You have to perform these two operations in a single storage procedure. Right? And in that storage procedure, whatever input parameter is required, that you need to pass from here. Right? Basically, the account number, account balance, right? This is the thing, right? In this case, balance is one of the parameter, right? And account number is one of the parameter. Transaction type, another parameter. Transaction details, another parameter, right? These are the things you need to pass as input parameter, right? And then if you are interested, you can use output parameter, and that output parameter value you need to set inside the database, right? And based on that output parameter value, you need to proceed further. If the parameter value indicating that output parameter value indicating that the transaction is successful, right? The update statements are successfully executed, then you need to proceed and do the rest of the thing, right? And in this case, again, you are going to do the same thing. And again, if that the storage procedure returning that the transaction is successful, I mean the update statement, insert statement are successfully executed, then only you can go and call this complete method. Clear?
Yeah, okay.
Right? So that's it for today. Any question from anyone?
Yeah, can I ask one question?
Yes, sure.
Yeah, so here in the example, we are creating multiple objects, right? For SQL, we are creating one object. For SQL command, we are creating one object. The same again, we are doing the same. Can we create a one single object for SQL connection and SQL command, and can we use that for all over the method?
See, first of all, you just tell me that here I'm changing the command text, right? So here I'm changing the command text and executing the query. So in this case, this command text is going to execute where?
Based on the first command.
Based on the connection string.
Yes.
That means this is a different database. Then if I'm using this command object and if I'm using this connection string, right, then how I can execute in a different database? Because in this case, we are having two different databases.
Okay.
Right? You understand my point?
Yeah, I got the point. If I'm using a single database, I can use that one, right?
Exactly. Single database, for single database, distributed transaction is not required. Previous example where we are showing, that is the example of a single database. Right?
Okay.
If you look at the previous example, right, then in that example, what I'm showing, I'm not creating different command object. Right? So in this example, you can see. So in this example, am I creating a one command object, right? Is there one connection object is there? For the second update statement, I'm using the same command object or I'm creating a different command object? I'm using the same command because in this case, with this command object, right, I'm going to execute on the same database. So no need to create a different one. So here you can see only one connection object is there, which is going to be used by two different commands, right? And again, here you need to create a new object because a new object statement is going to be executed. And if you don't want this approach, other approach is there. Can anybody tell me what is the other approach? Using single command way object, is it possible to execute two different commands? Yes, this is possible. How? Let me show you. So in this case, this is my command object, right? So what I can do is I can create the command object like this, right? Then what I need to do, I need to use a command text, right? The command text is going to be this one, right? And then what I need to do is then cmd dot connection, right? Connection is equal to this, cmd dot transaction equals to this. So in this case, I can simply comment this thing, right? So this is fine. Now it is executed. Now you want to execute a different command, right? So in that case, you just need to put this thing, right? So command dot command text equals to these things, right?
Okay, okay. By using these methods, based on the older one, it will boost our performance because here we are creating only one object. Before we have a two object, right? So it will reduce any space complexities like this.
Yeah, obviously it is going to reduce some space complexity.
Okay, so that is my question. So even I have used radio.net at the time. Earlier I was used creating multiple SQL command for each executing one queries. So that's my question.
Right.
So
No, this is absolutely fine. You can use one single say, but for that purpose, you cannot specify here, right? Even if you specify, right, if then you can later you can change this like this, right?
okay.
Right. Even this is also possible, right? So in this case, in this statement, right, I'm using this one. I can comment this one. Even I created the command object like this, right? Later, I can also change the command text. And again, I can call this execute query method, right? Everything is possible,
Okay.
right? Any question from anyone else? Okay. Okay, fine. Thank you, guys.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.